I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the design critique sheet, but also make a point about all the critique sheets. Let me start there. Don't ignore the critique sheets. Many people have been making mistakes by not, for example, with the presentation critique sheet, they have not been going over it very carefully. And so probably about half the students have failed to do parts of their responsibility. So either they have not given me a printout, because you're supposed to give me a printout of just like the handout printout with 6 slides to a page. You're supposed to hand that to me before you start so I can make notes on it for my grade. Probably half the people have not done that. Another group of people have not made questions with their PowerPoint. They're supposed to do questions and answers to go review at the end of their presentation, review with the students. And those can be used in my quizzes and stuff, quiz and the final exam even. So some have not done that. And then some have not bothered to send me their PowerPoint yet, which is the most obvious one. Those are the things that are most obvious to me because they're things I kind of depend on and that I expect to get, and I have to do something with them. I need to put your PowerPoint on Moodle, for example. And while I'm grading you, I want to have your printout for me to make notes on. And I expect to see the questions and answers at the end of your PowerPoint. And so when I don't see those, that's rather obvious. Whether or not you're paying attention to the other criteria to get a good grade, that is not always so obvious. It may, that you may have or may not have reviewed it, and you may or may not be capable of fulfilling some of the criteria in the criteria sheet. I expect that when I start going through the news stories, I'm going to find that some of you haven't. In fact, I know that some people still are asking questions that are in the criteria sheet for this class for news writing, and they keep asking me questions that are already answered in the criteria sheet. This one here, this criteria sheet is probably your most important, however. As I mentioned on Monday, 67% or something of your grade will come from your design projects. First off, your 3 major projects, your next 3 major projects after your story are all going to be design-related projects. So that's 9 times 3, that's 27. Of your final exam, most of your 40 out of your 50 points in your final exam will be based on a design project in class or in the final exam. So that's 40 points there. So 40 plus 27 is 67 points. So of all the, it is always important to understand how your professor is grading you, obviously. It should be obvious, but some people don't seem to think it's obvious. I use these critique sheets because I go into much more detail than I can go on in a in a matrix or whatever you want to call that. Typically, those do provide some information of how do you get a C, how do you get a D, how do you get a C, how do you get a B, how do you get an A. My critique sheet is much more in depth, but only tells you how to get an A. To not get an A, you have to not do something that I tell you to do. I figure that's pretty obvious. If you do what I tell you to do, you'll get an A. If you don't do what I tell you to do, you won't get an A. And the less you do of what I tell you to do, you'll get the lower the grade you'll get. And so that's what I prefer to give you these critique sheets in depth. This is well, when you take off this top part, it's basically a 2-page critique sheet in fairly small print. And you say, oh, that's so much to look at. Well, this is what you're being graded on. It should not be too much to look at because it's probably the most important thing you look at in preparing to do, for your grade, especially if your grade is 67% based on these particular projects. So take a look at this very carefully. We will go through them in more depth as we proceed in our tutorials and in our lectures. Just to remind you then, like as this goes over the different ways you're going to get points in this design environment, We're going to start off with the broadsheet news project, then we're going to go to tabloid, and then we're going to go to magazine, which will be the easiest. That one should be quite easy for you by then. Each week, with each of these projects, once we get started, you will have approximately 3 weeks to work on it. So you'll have some time, but you're not going to, we need to obviously get to work on it, or 2 to 3 weeks, something like that. So when we start looking through, okay, I guess I did not put it on here, but on your final syllabus, actually I guess it's closer to 2 weeks, sorry. You have about 2 weeks to work on it. So the first one will be due well, it says on the syllabus, it says it'll be due at the end of week 9, but in reality, it'll be Monday morning of week 10. So I'll give you the weekend to work on it in case you need to. And so Monday morning of week 10, it will be due. The one after that will be Monday morning of week 13. So you do have, well, I guess you do have 3 weeks there. And then your last one will be due basically Monday morning of week 16, if you would, the first day of your final exams. Obviously, you can hand in before that if you need to focus on your finals. And it should be the easiest one. As I said, the magazine is the easiest to design, and by then you'll have skills developed by having done 2 other projects before that. So yeah, basically you do have 3 weeks each one. So next week we're going to really get started on that. I think we're still trying to get Quark uploaded to our computers, and there's some problem. I just emailed our people here today, and they immediately sent another letter to Quark to find out why they hadn't gotten some technical assistance they needed. If nothing else, next week we will have loaded on all these a 1 week. In fact, we might get them to give us all a month-long, if necessary, a month-long free subscription to it. I have actually loaded a 1 week free subscription to this computer and a 1 week free subscription to my home computer in order to complete a professional project I was working on, a book cover I was working on. So I've been getting a little bit of recollection of like I used Quark for about 3 years, 2 or 3 years, but it was like 30 years ago. And so while a lot of it hasn't changed that much from what I've seen the last couple of weeks that I've been playing with it, still there's things I need to learn, I'm sure. They haven't updated for no good reason. So if we have to do that, and if you need to do that, you can go to quark.com, and it's fairly easy. The only thing is if your computer has with this computer, I didn't have a problem with my virus protection blocking it. With my home computer, I was using Norton's, and Norton's blocked it. So I had to turn Norton's off before I could load it on my home computer. Anyway, so some of you may have to do that. For those who are presenting, starting next week, we're supposed to have some presentations about it. Obviously, you can watch the YouTube videos that you're supposed to be watching, basing it on. There are 2 programs that could help you if we do not. Well, like I said, you can easily download a 1 week version of it. You should be able to. If you need some help, I can help you with that. But also 2 other things that will help a lot of people on their presentations are these 2 softwares, but particularly this one for the current, for those that are going to demonstrate starting next week. First off, EarthInView is a freeware. Both of these have a freeware portion to them. If I need to make a copy even of a shot from a video, I can do that with EarthInView. EarthInView will shoot anything that it sees, basically. Now, I may want to stop the video to a spot so that's not trying, so I'm just not shooting blindly, but if you shot enough times, you would probably get something good even if the video was running. But if I were, here in IrfanView, it's spelled IrfanView, and you find it something like irfanview.org or something like that. Anyway, once you load it, you have one of the options under Options is this Capture Screenshot. And the screenshot basically allows you to name whatever you want to name it. So you can, here I just put NWS for news. It will, after that, we'll put a number on it. So it'll be NWS 001, NWS 002. It will number it for you. You can leave this part on or not. This gives you the day and the date, the day, and the exact hour and minutes and seconds, actually, of when you made a major copy. So you can always know, you can remind yourself which was the first, which was the last, and so forth. So it will automatically rename. You can put down the first part of the name, and it will put the rest in itself. You can tell it where you want to save it, exactly where you want to save it, and you can make it go into the format you want. In this case, I usually save in TIFF unless I know I'm going to immediately put it online. TIFF does not, you can't do web development, web design, anything with TIFF. In that case, you need JPEG, but for our purposes here, by the way, when you're doing your photos, if you have a choice, TIFF is a better quality than JPEG. And so when I'm doing things for my publications, I use TIFF. And so I have a choice. With that down arrow, you have a choice of lots of different formats. Those are two formats, JPEG and TIFF are just two of them. If I hit the down arrow there, like I said, you see you have lots of formats in which you can save it. So you can save it, different than your print screen. You get a better quality. You can save it exactly in the format you want. You can anyway, when you want to save it, what you're going to do is you're going to find whatever it is you want to shoot. So let's say I go to a video and I turn it on.
Scheme and debate. A bill in the California State Senate would make it.
Okay, if I hit Control F11.
For full health care coverage to illegal immigrants.
See, Control F11 up here.
$3 billion, and critics say it could devastate the economy of the fiscally fragile state. Let's discuss this.
It'd be best if I stop it, because otherwise, like I say, I don't know, did I catch her with her mouth open or eyes shut or something like that. I'll say this is okay. Hit Control F11. It rings a bell, and it tells me it saved it where I want it to be saved, in TIFF, like I want it to be saved there. I go to that site, which was actually in a different course. I didn't change it. So that was in my Success Strategies course and in week 4. And we see it, so we'll see it at the top of the list here once it comes up. IrfanView, by the way, is just basically free Photoshop. So if you don't have Photoshop, if you can't afford a copy of Photoshop, IrfanView is a free Photoshop. It's a very good software. There's lots of YouTube videos to teach how to use it. Anyway, so here is the one I just made. So I open that up. And here it is. If I just want the picture from the video, I can go ahead and just kind of draw a box around it. Maybe I'll come down to put the information on it. Go up to Edit and hit Crop Selection. I can also go to Image and double check the size and some other things. I can play with the color and stuff, just like Photoshop. Telling me I've got it's 6 inches wide by 4 inches tall. I can change the DPI, the dots per inch, make it a little bit better quality, go to 300 DPI, for example, hit OK. And then to save it, I can go back, and the easiest way is to just hit Save in the original folder, so that goes right back to where it was. And if I don't change the name, it will change the original file, or I can change it, and I can maybe just cut off the date and time stuff and just hit the news 006 and hit save. And that's a TIFF file I can use in PowerPoint or wherever I want to use it. This could be of value to all of you at some point in time. It is a very good Photoshop type software. It is free, and it has a screen capture as an additional function that works very well. There are softwares, and I do not have them in this computer, there are softwares also that will allow you to download YouTube videos. And so if we do not get the software in time for you to prepare for your presentation, those that are doing a presentation the next week or so and supposed to be demonstrating how to use Quark Express, you could first off use this function to create your PowerPoint, and you could take some excerpts from the videos. Now, if you don't have I can find a freeware for you to do that. If you don't have one, you can email me and I'll send you the name of it. I just don't remember off the top of my head, and it's on my home computer. But Screencast-O-Matic would work. That's the program I use to make my in-class videos. And I can make a video of videos if I want to with Screencast-O-Matic. And so at screencast-o-matic.com, I believe it is, dot something, but I'm pretty sure it's .com, screencast-o-matic. This is also, they have a freeware that will let you make videos of up to 15 minutes long. Other than that, you have to pay $15 a year to get a limitless version of their software. So also, if you didn't want to download and you just want to open up a video and capture part of it, you just open it up and you use Screencast-O-Matic. There's also videos both at that site. Screencast-O-matic.com has lots of training videos. They're also on YouTube. Most, if not all of them, are on YouTube also. But it's pretty easy to use. And you're somewhat familiar by the fact that we've been doing it in all my classes. So those are some softwares that could help. Let me go back to the other thing I was going to talk about, though, before we get started with the presentations, and that is this. I did go over in the other class of just the first part of this, just to kind of give you just to kind of get you started. And so the first part, let me back up just a second. So this critique is not just about design. For short, I will call it your design project, but it's not a design project only. So one part of your grade on your design project is design. But that's only 25%. So where's the rest of the 100% coming from to grade your design projects? Secondly, your graphics, 20%. Things like, did you choose a good photo for your center of focus? Did you crop it well? Things like that. Did you put in captions when they're needed? Things like that. Headlines. Did you do a good headline? So this has a section telling you how to do headlines and giving you some very specific rules on how to do it. We will talk about that in class, but this goes into a lot of detail right here within the design critique sheet on how to do headlines. And then the text. Did you handle the text properly? We're saying for our assignments, we're going to use justification on the text. Even though all the newspapers I've had that I've actually owned, that I had control over, and I guess even the one that a group of 4 newspapers I was running were for somebody else as publisher and editor, I went ragged right, what we call ragged right, which is not justified. The columns are not lined up on the right side. They're allowed to have natural spacing between letters. When you do a justified text, it puts false spacing between the words. And so in order to make it line up on both left and right, and while that is the norm of our industry, research shows that people actually understand they remember what they read better if it's not justified. And it also gives you more white space. So anybody who likes white space, to have a ragged right gives more white space. It's more obviously the text, the columns have more space between them, and so forth. They seem to have more, well, they do have more space. Some lines maybe not. A few lines maybe go all the way to the limit, but most of your text lines of text will not go anywhere close to the edge, so you end up with more white space between your columns. So I prefer ragged right, unjustified, but because the norm is justified, we will use justified in this class. It also tells what size it should be, and we'll talk more about style later. And how to put in jump lines, what we call vertical justification, lining up the tops and bottoms of each column, called vertical justification, things like that. Having a consistent indent on your paragraphs. And then the last part is editing, and that's only normally worth 10%. I could make it worth more than that for the final exam, because I may, for example, purposely put some bad editing or some bad grammar and stuff into the first few paragraphs of each story. Like maybe the first 4 paragraphs of each of 4 stories I give you in the final exam might purposely have some misspellings and bad grammar in them. And so for your final exam, I might say it's worth more than 10%, because I want you to have improved your spelling and grammar and your ability to edit text. I don't know. It may be worth 10%. It may not. I may not even do that. I haven't created a final exam yet. Just going through the front real quick. We've talked about some of this already, but your basic design suggests your biggest headlines and your biggest photo, your center of focus, should be in the upper part of your design. I'll be going through this again elsewhere, so I'm going to go through this real quickly. We talked about that when we were talking about those 7 sports pages we were looking at on Monday with different designs. And the very worst ones violated Rule 2 here, in that they had their center of focus at the bottom of the page. The natural way for people to look at in English anyway, to look at a page is start up upper left and weave their way down to lower right. They start upper left, end up lower right. But if your center of focus is in the bottom of the page, then they're naturally going to be drawn to that center of focus at the bottom of the page. And so where do they go from there? If they're not starting up towards the top, they may never go back to the top. So you don't want your center of focus at the bottom. It doesn't look right, first off, but secondly, you may lose readers by having your center of focus on the bottom of the page. Your story should all be rectangular, what we call modular. The exception to that is, say, on an inside page that has ads on it. You don't have to worry about ads for our purposes, but if you're actually working at a real newspaper, they might have ads, and the ads don't even out necessarily. So they may have some ads that stick up a little bit, and you're going to have to wrap your story around those ads. Well, that's not your fault. You can't be modular at that point, because you're wrapping around the ads that they've placed there. So that's the main exception. The other exception is if you have a package of stories, usually 2 stories that are related to each other. And so you might have one major headline relating to both of them, and then you may have one story then with a subhead that's coming down the left side, one coming down the right side, and the one on the left side will weave underneath your art, your photograph, whereas the one on the right side will stop when it gets to that level. So your package is rectangular, but your stories within the package are not rectangular because they're mixed together. It's a package, it's not one individual story. You will, the most important thing that a lot of these relate to is do not confuse your reader. And so I've had some students do an L-shaped layout and go backwards with their text. So they come down the right column and then go backwards to the first column. No way you can do that. Nothing to confuse your readers. This does relate then to some of the following requirements. One is keep your story under the headline, typically. And if you have a side saddle sort of headline that's not over the top of your story, in other words, when we talk about top of the story, we're talking about, say, if it's a tabloid, a 4-column story, and you have a 4-column headline on top, underneath it you split the story into four columns underneath it. Perhaps some of that's interrupted by a photo or whatever, but basically your headline goes across the top, your story and art goes across the bottom. It's in a squared, it's a rectangular, but that headline over the top shows ownership. This story goes with this headline, and people are used to that. 90% of all stories, the headline goes over the top, more than 90% probably, but the headline goes over the top of the entire story, and it shows ownership. If you had that sort of a story across the top of your page, and then you put a side saddle underneath it, now you have a good chance of confusing some readers, because they come down reading in column 3 of the first story, and now there's no headline to break it off between column 3 of the first story and column 3 of the second story, because you're using a side saddle headline. That's why I said when you use a side saddle or something where your headline is not across the top, you need to box it so that nobody gets confused. They don't try to read from, like I say, down a column of one and jump immediately into the text of another story that's underneath it, because there's no headline over it. So the general rule is put a headline over it, but other than that, if it doesn't have a headline over it, then box it. Box the whole story and headline together. That is, put a graphic box around it. Jumping first to number 7, we talked about it, about the golden triangle. You have a big piece of art, the upper left perhaps. It could be in the upper right also. Research shows it's best at the upper left, but if all of your stories have your main art to the upper left, it's going to be boring. So you can't make the same layout with all the pages. But it could be towards the left, it could be in the center, it could be to the right, but then you're going to create that golden triangle, and that creates both dynamic flow plus what in the business we call balance, but it's not really true balance. So if you have your picture in the upper left, then you have a picture to the middle right, and then you have a picture to the lower left, that creates your golden triangle. You have art that overlaps into all 4 quadrants, but it's not a perfect balance. If you put weight to them by how many square inches they are, it's still going to be that in this version I'm talking about, it'd be weighted to the left. But that's not what we talk about by balance. We just want to make sure that there's art in all parts of the page. And you don't want all of your art to the left. You don't want all of your art to the right. You don't want all of your art to the top. You don't want all of your art to the bottom. You need some balance between top, bottom, left, right. But it's not a perfect balance, and we don't want it to be a perfect balance. We want the dynamic flow that we talked about, the golden triangle. As you're creating, you don't want things too tight. You don't want text touching if you put a graphic box around a story for some reason, because it's a side saddle or for some other reason, you don't want the box touching your text. And so you need to be very careful. You have to learn how to get that text away from the graphic box so it's not touching it. Otherwise, I'll be saying it's too tight. You don't want your headline touching your text. You don't want, in other words, you just have to have a space between each element of your page. And if you have things touching each other, unless it's clearly purposeful, like sometimes overlapping photos is kind of artistic. You overlap one photo with another photo. Okay, if that's on purpose and it's clearly on purpose, that's okay. But if it's an accidental or you're too lazy or whatever, you can't see that looks bad, well, then it's not okay. We showed on one of those sports pages that they had an art at the very bottom, art at the top, but they had a center that had no art. We call that being gray. So you don't want too much gray at one spot. So that's an important rule. On the other hand, we don't want to just leave white space for no reason. So I've had some students, they run out of text and they didn't want to increase the size of their art and they didn't know how to do a pull-out quote, so they just left a blank box of white at the end of the story. Well, that's going to get you deducted a lot of points off. You can't just leave white because you're too lazy or too ignorant to know how to fill it up. You have to fill that space. And finally, don't tombstone. And this is 2 headlines next to each other. And the rule we had was one of those stories has to be boxed. We had a wonderful design editor at the daily paper I was at, and we had him for, I think he left after 1 year after I arrived, and then they assigned his duties to all of the copy editors. So we were all doing front pages and stuff, whereas before that he did all the front pages, and he was a wonderful designer. And I learned a lot from him, and that I took with me as I proceeded on in my career. But one of the things he did was this idea of if you have two stories next to each other, with headlines next to each other, you box one of them, usually the wider of the stories. If one is 3 columns, one's 1 column, box the 3-column one typically. That also is a suggestion that it might have bigger art with it also. It just looks better if you box the bigger story. And if you follow that rule, then when we start looking at these American newspapers that are putting lines every place, lines gone crazy, those are not necessary if you kept the rule of this design editor that I follow. 1 box is typically enough for a page, and 2 boxes for sure is always, at least I can't remember a time when 2 boxes weren't adequate. And even then, the second box would be like boxing a small 1-column story or something at the bottom. So you might box a big story at the top, and then a small story in the lower right or something to keep them apart from each other. And you don't need put lines every place, which to me just looks bad, looks junky. Okay, well, I just wanted to go through part of this to kind of give you an idea of what sort of things you can find in this critique sheet. And again, emphasize you need to be very familiar with this critique sheet as we go into this next project, major project 2.